What's up? Welcome to your Self-Helpless snack, where we give you a little taste of the Self-Helpless podcast with a mini episode. If you want to dive deeper into this topic, you can find the full episode linked in this episode's description. What do you agree with or disagree with when it comes to like the 5 stages of grief? Would you change anything?
100%. So
Yeah.
I agree that the 5 stages was really valuable in the time that it was created, right? I agree that the conversations that it sparked, because nobody was really talking about it in the way that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler did, really was necessary and valuable. But I also just think people don't understand the context that, most people assume it's about grief, and they don't understand that really that work was about hospice patients initially, right? That was the study of people coming to terms with a terminal diagnosis. I'll deny, and then I'll get angry, and then I'll bargain, and then acceptance, denial, all that. So then later that work was then applied to On Grief and Grieving. So it was on death and dying first, and then on grief and grieving. And even Elizabeth Kubler-Ross later in her life, and especially on her deathbed, deeply regretted how people took her work and made it this linear staged thing. I mean, she was basically trying to say, hey, here's what it can look like. And then everybody else saw that and went, oh, here's what it should look like. And so then people use it against themselves. Instead of saying, grief is as unique as your fingerprint and you can't do it wrong and it doesn't end, we went with, I don't know, am I angry enough? Is this denial? Like, what, am I at acceptance? It is one way of thinking of grief, but it is not representative. And there are so many other ways of, thinking about grief that have happened since, I'm 47. I think I was 4 when the 5 stages was created. It's been a few decades.
Right.
Yeah. What are some of the ones that you feel like could give more value to people?
The one I find to be particularly useful for people is the dual process model of grief, which is essentially the idea that you can take all activities after a loss and divide them up into 2 buckets. So some activities are going to be loss oriented, meaning thinking about the loss, relating to the loss, feeling the feelings of the loss, dealing with the loss, like loss related. That's one bucket. And then the other bucket is restoration. So things that are not related to the loss, which means taking a break from the loss, doing anything but the loss. It doesn't mean living life as though the loss didn't happen, because that's not possible, but it means laughing. It means Netflix binges. It means, living your life. And so often people come to me so worried about doing grief right, or thinking that there's a way to do it wrong. And they're very focused on the loss related activities. And then when they notice themselves drifting into the restorative activities, which of course they aren't labeling as that, but then they tend to judge themselves and tell themselves that, like, oh, I shouldn't be avoiding this, or it's not okay for me to laugh, or, but really what the dual process model says is that it's the intentional oscillation. We think about our loss, we deal with it, and then we take a break from it.
Yeah.
And we go back and forth. And that's the goodness, right? So let's schedule the Netflix binges. Let's not give ourselves a hard time about that. Let's put time in our calendar where we give ourselves permission to laugh and think about other things and find hobbies and connections and things that are unrelated. I find that one to be particularly useful. But some of the things that I later look back at and think did help me, for sure, I gave myself, for me, this really helped, a lot of time on my back porch. For me, my back porch in the old house that I used to live in, I would go out there barefoot. And so I think I didn't really understand it then, but I think I was kind of grounding at the time. And I was in nature because there was nothing behind me. It was kind of a unique little piece of property. And just to be in a space where I could look at flowers and watch birds and breathe, and not have a kid asking for something, or, a demand being placed on me, and giving myself that gift of time. And then I would go back and I would write a lot to him. And that was really, really helpful to me. I got a weighted blanket. I slept with a big stuffed animal. I would put pillows all around myself, and I didn't force myself to do things that I didn't feel ready for. Yeah. But, the basics, honestly, water, trying to sleep, decent nutrition, those things, they're so valuable. I had to really slow myself down.
How do you feel about being in a romantic relationship in the future, or maybe you are now, I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you feel like that person would have to understand what I've been through and kind of been through it themselves? Are you just terrified? Like, what's the point? Where do you stand on that?
Yeah. So I am in one, and I waited for about 3.5 years or so before I started dating. And by the time I started dating, I just decided I had gotten myself to a place where I realized that I was responsible for my satisfaction with life. It was an inside thing. Like, I truly, genuinely believed there was no hole I needed to fill. There was no missing piece, right? Like, I was not needing to be in a relationship. I felt really good in my life, and a relationship felt like fun. It felt interesting. It felt like a bonus, which is not often where I see us getting into relationships after spousal loss, but I did get myself there, and that's why I think it's been such an easier experience for me, because I did, when I started dating, I connected with somebody pretty instantly, and we've been together since, and we live together now. He's not a widower. He's divorced, so he understands what it's like to have to go through all of that. But no, he doesn't really understand grief in terms of spousal loss. His sister did die by suicide, and so he's been through a significant loss. But what was important for me is not that somebody had had a similar life experience, but that they understood that, grief is always going to be a part of my life. I did not choose to leave Hugo, right? It happened, and I never wanted it to happen. And so he is still in my heart. There will always be a very important space there, and I will always tell stories about him. I will keep his memory alive, and if I just decided I'm not going to date somebody who's not okay with that. Right. If they aren't confident enough in themselves to let me have my own emotional experience and not make it mean anything about them, then they just aren't the person for me. And I think I just happened to find that.
So glad you tuned into Self-Helpless. If you felt supported by this or past episodes, there are a couple ways you can help the show. Feel free to share it with a friend who may enjoy the variety of discussions we have here. Also, you can become a monthly or annual supporter of the podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/selfhelpless. That's where you can pitch and vote on topics, submit questions for special guests, or be a silent supporter and not participate in any of that. 100% of Patreon and merch proceeds go directly to operating expenses that not only keep the show going through thick and thin, but also keeps it accessible to all with minimal ads. If you want to show a little extra lovin', you can leave an Apple Podcast review or send an email to share how Self-Helpless has impacted you. All of this info and more goodies can be found at selfhelplesspodcast.com. All right, love you big time, and thank you so much.